Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The stars looked different through the observation window of the Aurora. After 11 months in deep space, Dr. Daniel Cross had memorized every constellation, every nebula, every cosmic landmark between Earth and his destination. Tomorrow, all of that would change. Tomorrow they would arrive at Threshold 7, the planet that shouldn't exist. Daniel pressed the record button on his personal log, his 43rd year showing in the lines around his eyes. Final approach log, Dr. Daniel Cross, Chief Exobiologist. We're 12 hours from orbital insertion. The crew is ready, the equipment is calibrated, and I'm terrified. Not of what we'll find, but of what it means if I'm right. He paused, staring at the data streams flowing across his screen. The biological signals from Threshold 7 had been getting simpler for a decade. Not weaker, simpler. Like a symphony playing backward, each note reducing in complexity until only a single tone remained. Captain Reeves thinks I'm being paranoid, he continued, rubbing his tired eyes. Maybe I am. But I keep thinking about what Dr. Petrov told me about Vostok, about her mentor, Sergei, about what they found under all that ice. He stopped the recording and pulled up a classified file he'd been given access to before the mission. The Lake Vostok incident of 2012. Russian scientists drilling through nearly 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice to reach a subglacial lake that had been sealed off from the world for millions of years. They'd gone silent for 6 days. When contact resumed, the team reported success, but something had changed. Within months, several team members began showing signs of severe psychological trauma. One of them, Dr. Sergei Volkov, had disappeared into the Siberian wilderness and was found 6 months later, non-verbal, living in a cave, having forgotten language itself. The official report blamed isolation psychosis and exposure to unknown microorganisms, but Alina Petrov, Sergei's protege, had told Daniel something different during their long conversations on the journey out. Sergei had tried to tell her something before his mind collapsed completely. He'd drawn symbols obsessively, spirals that curved inward, always inward, ending at a point, and he'd whispered one phrase over and over: the water remembers everything going back. The door hissed open behind him. Dr. Alina Petrov entered, her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. At 52, she carried herself with the rigid discipline of someone who'd seen things she couldn't forget. Her dark eyes, so much like Sergei's in the old photographs Daniel had seen, held a mixture of determination and dread. "You're recording again," she said, not quite a question. Daniel nodded. "Someone should document this. If things go wrong, we follow protocol. We abort and return home." Alina sat across from him, her posture rigid. "But they won't go wrong. We're prepared. We have protocols that the Endeavour mission didn't have. We have better equipment. We know what we're walking into." "Do we?" Daniel pulled up an image on his screen. "Look at this time-lapse. That city has been degrading for 3 years. Not crumbling, degrading. The architecture is becoming simpler. Glass and metal turning to stone, stone turning to compacted earth. It's like watching construction footage played in reverse, but it's happening in real time." Alina studied the image, her jaw tightening. She was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Sergei drew buildings like that in his final weeks before he disappeared. He'd sketch these elaborate structures, then erase them piece by piece, simplifying them until they were just rough shapes. His therapist thought it was a coping mechanism. I think he was trying to warn us. Warn us about what? That evolution isn't a ladder. It's a wheel. And under certain conditions, it can turn backward. She stood, moving to the window to stare at the approaching star system. The Lake Vostok water samples showed something. The official reports were sanitized, but I accessed Sergei's personal notes before they were confiscated. He found microorganisms in the ice cores that shouldn't have existed. Simple bacterial forms, but their DNA showed markers of having once been more complex, like they'd devolved. He called it retrograde cellular expression. His theory was that in sealed, isolated environments, some unknown trigger could cause organisms to revert to earlier evolutionary states. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. And you think that's what we're going to find on Threshold 7? I think Sergei saw a preview of what's happening there. A small-scale version contained under kilometers of ice. But this planet... She turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw genuine fear in her eyes. This is the same thing happening to an entire biosphere. And if we're not careful, we'll end up just like Sergei. Or worse. Before Daniel could respond, the intercom crackled to life. All senior crew to the bridge. Captain's orders. We've got something on long-range scans you need to see. The bridge of the Aurora was designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Captain Diana Reeves stood at the central console, her silver hair cropped military short, her posture ramrod straight despite 15 years in deep space. She'd commanded 3 previous deep space missions and had a reputation for getting her crews home alive. Her face was unreadable, but Daniel noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tapped against the console, a nervous tell he'd learned to recognize over their months together. Dr. James Whitmore, the ship's medical officer, leaned against a nearby station, his weathered face betraying his 58 years. A former military surgeon who'd served in 3 conflicts before transitioning to space medicine, James had an unflappable demeanor that made him the emotional anchor of the crew. But even he looked troubled now. Liam Foster, the 28-year-old communications specialist on his first deep space mission, hunched over his console, fingers flying across holographic controls, his youthful face creased with concentration. "We have a problem," Reeves said without preamble. "Liam, show them what you found." The main screen flickered to life, displaying a hulking shape in low orbit around Threshold 7. It took Daniel a moment to recognize it. An Earth vessel. Old design, the kind they'd stopped manufacturing about 30 years ago. The hull was pitted and scarred, partially covered in what looked like organic growth. "That's the Endeavour," James said, his Texan drawl unmistakable, even through the shock in his voice. "The probe mission from 59. They were supposed to do a flyby survey, maybe land for a few days to collect samples, then return. 6-month round trip. Maximum." "They never returned," Liam added, pulling up the mission data on a secondary screen. Last transmission was logged 73 days after arrival. Commander Patricia Wells reported they'd landed to collect biological samples from one of the cities, said they'd made an extraordinary discovery and would be extending their stay by 2 weeks. Then, nothing. No distress call, no malfunction alerts. Just silence. Search and rescue mission was planned but scrapped due to budget cuts and the distance involved. Daniel leaned forward, studying the derelict ship. "Can you get a closer scan? Life signs?" Liam worked his console, enhancing the image. "That's the strange part. The ship's reactor is still operational. Life support is functioning at minimal levels, but I'm not reading any life signs. At least, not human life signs. There's definitely biological activity aboard, but the signatures are... I don't know how to describe it. They're reading as less complex than human, more primitive." Alina moved closer to the screen. her hand unconsciously gripping the edge of the console. "Show me the biological signatures. Compare them to human baseline." Liam brought up the comparative analysis. The readings showed humanoid forms, roughly the right size and mass, but the complexity of their biological systems was significantly reduced. Simplified neural networks, less sophisticated organ systems, more primitive skeletal structure. "It's like looking at human ancestors," Alina whispered. "Early hominids, proto-humans from maybe 2 million years ago." "That's impossible," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't devolve a human being. Evolution doesn't work backward." "It's not supposed to," Daniel said quietly, "but what if something on that planet can force it to? What if the microorganisms in the atmosphere or the soil have the ability to trigger retrograde genetic expression? We'd be looking at the biological equivalent of running time backward." Reeves held up a hand. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We proceed as planned. Orbital insertion in 6 hours. We'll dock with the Endeavour first, investigate what happened to the crew, gather whatever data their systems recorded. Then we make an informed decision about whether to proceed with a surface landing. Liam, I want continuous scans of our own biological systems. Any deviation from baseline, any anomaly at all, you report it immediately. Understood?" "Yes, Captain." "James, prepare quarantine protocols. If we're bringing anything back from that ship, I want it contained and analysed before it gets anywhere near the rest of us." "Already on it." Reeves turned to Daniel and Alina. "You two start going through the Endeavour's mission profile. I want to know everything about what they were doing down there, what they found, and what their last coherent thoughts were before things went wrong. We've got 6 hours. Let's use them." Daniel couldn't sleep during the remaining hours. He sat in the research lab with Alina, surrounded by holographic displays, showing every piece of information they had on the Endeavour mission. Commander Patricia Wells had been a decorated officer with 20 years of experience. Her crew consisted of 5 specialists: Dr. Richard Brennan, a xenobiologist, Dr. Carmen Ortiz, a geologist, Lieutenant Thomas Griffin, the pilot, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a microbiologist, and Specialist David Morse, an engineer. The mission logs from the first 60 days were routine. Standard surveys, atmospheric analysis, preliminary biological sampling. The excitement in Wells's voice was evident in her video logs as she described the planet. "It's like Earth but different," she'd said in one entry. "The evolutionary paths here took different turns, but the end results are remarkably similar. Parallel evolution on a stunning scale. The cities we've observed from orbit show clear signs of advanced civilization, but there's no response to our hails. Either they're gone, or they're choosing not to respond." On day 47, Wells logged their decision to land near one of the smaller cities. "The architecture is extraordinary. Organic curves mixed with geometric precision. Some of the materials appear to be a hybrid of biological and synthetic, almost grown rather than built. We're seeing no signs of current habitation, but the structures are intact. We should be able to learn a great deal about whoever built this place." The logs from the first week on the surface were filled with scientific enthusiasm. Brennan had found evidence of a complex ecosystem with species occupying similar niches to Earth animals, but with fascinating variations. Ortiz had collected geological samples suggesting the planet had a stable climate for at least 50 million years. Tanaka had isolated microorganisms from the soil that showed unusual properties, though her notes were frustratingly vague about what those properties were. Then, on day 61, the tone shifted. Wells's video log showed her looking tired, confused. "We've noticed something disturbing. The city we've been studying is changing, not degrading in the normal sense, but simplifying. A building we documented last week had an elaborate facade with what we interpreted as decorative elements. Today, those elements are gone. The facade is smoother, less detailed. Griffin suggests it might be some kind of smart material that responds to environmental conditions, but I'm not so sure. And there's something else. Morse has been having trouble with his memory. Simple things at first, forgetting where he left tools, mixing up procedures. But this morning he couldn't remember the access code to the ship, a code he inputs a dozen times a day. The next several logs showed the crew's growing alarm. Brennan reported that several of the animals they'd have been studying were changing before their eyes. I observed a mammalian predator, something like a large cat, over the course of 8 hours today. Its morphology shifted. The bone structure in its skull simplified, becoming more robust but less refined. Its coat changed from smooth fur to something coarser. By the end of my observation period, it resembled something from Earth's Pleistocene epoch, more than the sleek predator it had been that morning. Ortiz had become obsessed with the buildings, taking measurements every few hours and watching in horror as they degraded in reverse, moving from complex to simple, from refined to primitive. "It's not decay," she insisted in one log. "Decay is random, entropic. This is ordered, intentional, like watching a sculpture being unmade, step by step, back to raw clay." Tanaka's logs became increasingly technical and frantic. She'd isolated the mechanism, or thought she had. The microorganisms in the soil, in the air, everywhere. They're unlike anything in Earth's databases. They interact with cellular DNA in a way I've never seen. It's as if they're reading the genetic code backward, triggering the expression of ancestral genes while suppressing more recent evolutionary developments. I need more time to study this, but I'm starting to think we should leave. Soon. But they didn't leave. Day 73 was the last log from Wells. Her face on the screen looked younger, the grey in her hair fading to brown, the lines around her eyes smoothing out. But her eyes themselves looked wrong, unfocused, childlike. "We're having trouble with the ship systems," she said slowly, as if searching for each word. "Too complicated. Too many buttons and switches. Morse tried to start the launch sequence today but got confused. Sat there for an hour just staring at the controls. Brennan is worse. He stopped talking, in complete sentences. Mostly grunts now. Tanaka says our brains are being affected. Hippocampus regression. Memory formation reversing. We need to leave, but nobody can remember how to fly the ship anymore." The log ended there. No final goodbyes, no dramatic last words. Just a confused woman struggling to express a thought her mind was no longer complex enough to fully form. "There's more," Liam said, appearing in the doorway of the lab. He looked pale, shaken. "I've been analysing the automated sensor logs from the Endeavour. They kept recording even after the crew stopped making manual entries. I've compiled some of the data into a timeline. You need to see this." He brought up a three-dimensional graph showing biological complexity measurements over time for each crew member. For the first 60 days, the lines were stable, flat, showing normal human baseline readings. Then, starting around day 61, the lines began to slope downward, gradually at first, then accelerating. By day 90, all 6 crew members showed biological complexity, roughly equivalent to early Homo erectus. By day 120, they were closer to Australopithecus. The graph continued for another 60 days before the sensors stopped recording reliable data, but the trajectory was clear. The crew of the Endeavour had regressed through millions of years of human evolution in less than 6 months. "There's something else," Liam continued. "I found one more video file. It's corrupted, fragmented, but it was recorded on day 130, 3 days after Wells's last coherent log. I've cleaned it up as much as I can, but it's disturbing, really disturbing. I think you should watch it before we dock with the ship so you know what we might be walking into." Daniel and Alina exchanged glances. "Play it," Daniel said. The screen flickered, showing the interior of the Endeavour's main cabin. The image quality was poor, the footage jumping and fragmenting. but what it showed was clear enough. Commander Wells sat on the floor, her uniform torn and dirty. She was arranging small objects, stones and bits of metal, into simple patterns. She'd pick them up, stack them, knock them over, then laugh, a high-pitched giggle that sounded nothing like the professional officer from the earlier logs. Around her, 3 other figures sat or crouched. They were naked, their bodies covered in hair that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there all along. Dormant genes, reactivated. One of them, Morse based on his size, was rocking back and forth, making a rhythmic grunting sound. Another, Tanaka, was examining her own hands with fascination, as if seeing them for the first time. But the worst was Dr. Richard Brennan. He was on his hands and knees in the corner of the cabin, his posture completely transformed. His spine had curved, his head thrust forward. He was sniffing at the floor, moving with an animalistic gait. When he turned toward the camera, his face was still recognizably human, but the expression was gone. The intelligence, the awareness, everything that made him a person had vanished. What looked back was something that might have been human once, might be human again in a few million years, but in that moment was something else entirely. Something less. Something that came before. The video cut out. The lab was silent except for the hum of the ship's systems. Finally, James spoke from the doorway where he'd been watching. "We can't land on that planet. Whatever's down there, whatever's causing this, we can't risk exposure." "We have to," Daniel said quietly. "If we don't understand what's happening, if we don't document it and bring back enough data to convince Earth to quarantine this entire system, someone else will come. Another expedition, colonists, explorers, and the same thing will happen to them. We need to know how it works, how fast it acts, if there's any way to reverse it or protect against it." "Daniel's right," Reeves said, entering the lab. She'd been listening from the corridor. "But we take every precaution. Full isolation suits, no exposure to the atmosphere. We limit surface time to 6 hours maximum. And if anyone shows even the slightest sign of cognitive impairment, we abort immediately and return to orbit." "What about the Endeavour?" Liam asked. "The crew? If they're still alive down there, shouldn't we try to help them?" "Help them how?" James asked, though his voice was gentle. "Bring them back? In that state? Even if we could reverse what's happened to them, and I'm not sure we can. The psychological trauma alone would be catastrophic. They've lost 30 years of human evolution, Liam. Their brains don't have the neural architecture for human thought anymore. They're not people anymore. They're our ancestors. So we just leave them?" "We document their fate," Alina said firmly. "We make sure the universe knows what happened to the crew of the Endeavour. That's the best we can do for them now. Honour their sacrifice by learning from it." The docking procedure was tense. Liam piloted the Aurora carefully alongside the Endeavour, matching its slow orbital drift. The older ship looked worse up close, its hull scarred and pitted, covered in a thin film of organic material that seemed to pulse slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the ship itself was breathing. James suited up with Reeves, both of them entering through the Aurora's airlock with portable scanners and sample collection equipment. Daniel, Alina and Liam monitored from the bridge, watching the video feeds from their helmet cameras. The interior of the Endeavour was a nightmare. What had once been a state-of-the-art research vessel was now a cave. The walls were covered in the same organic material they'd seen on the exterior, but thicker here, growing in strange patterns. Equipment had been torn apart, not with tools but with bare hands, wires and circuits scattered across the floor. The lighting was dim, emergency power only, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. "Biological readings are off the charts," James reported. "Whatever's growing on these walls, it's not from Earth. Probably local organisms from the planet that somehow got brought aboard." They moved deeper into the ship, checking each compartment. The crew quarters were destroyed, personal effects scattered and torn. The research lab was a mess of broken equipment and spilled samples, but it was the main cabin that stopped them cold. 6 figures huddled in the shadows. At first, Daniel thought they might be dead, desiccated corpses left to decay in the ship's recycled atmosphere. But then one of them moved, shifting position with an awkward, unfamiliar motion. Reeves approached slowly, her hand on the stunner at her hip, though Daniel doubted she'd actually use it. "Commander Wells," Reeves said softly. "Commander, can you hear me? It's Captain Diana Reeves from the Aurora. We're here to help." The figure turned. In the dim light, Daniel could see her face on the video feed. She looked young, no more than 25, though her personnel file said she'd been 47 when the mission launched. Her hair was long and tangled, her body covered in coarse hair. She looked at Reeves with curiosity, but no recognition. No understanding that the suited figure before her was another human being. She made a sound, not quite a word, more of a questioning grunt. "Jesus Christ," Liam whispered on the bridge. "That's really her." James ran his medical scanner over the group. Cognitive function is minimal. Language centers are largely inactive. They're operating on instinct and basic problem solving. Maybe the intelligence level of a 2-year-old, if that. Physically, their bodies have regressed to something like early Homo habilis, maybe 2 million years back in the evolutionary chain. "Can we help them?" Reeves asked, though Daniel could hear in her voice that she already knew the answer. "Not with anything we have on this ship. Maybe not with anything we have, period. We're not talking about a disease or an injury. We're talking about fundamental rewriting of their genetic expression. Every cell in their bodies has been altered. To reverse this, we'd need to understand the mechanism completely, develop some kind of genetic therapy, and even then..." James trailed off. "Even then, the people they were are gone. The neural pathways that made them who they were, that stored their memories and personalities, those are gone. We'd be creating new people in their bodies." Reeves was silent for a long moment. "Can we make them comfortable? Is there anything they need?" "They need food, water, basic care. But honestly, Captain, they'd probably be better off on the surface. This ship isn't a good environment for them anymore. Too artificial. They can't operate the systems, can't maintain the life support. They're living like primitives in a metal box." "Recommendations? We document everything, take biological samples with their implied consent, though I'm not even sure that concept applies anymore. Then we leave them. When we're done with the surface mission, we could potentially transport them down to the planet. Let them live out their lives in an environment better suited to what they've become." Daniel watched the video feed, his heart aching. Commander Patricia Wells sat on the floor, picking through a pile of debris, occasionally making soft cooing sounds to the others. This woman had commanded a starship, had held advanced degrees, had a family waiting for her back on Earth. Now she couldn't even recognize her own species. And somewhere down on that planet, there was something that had done this to her, something that could do it to anyone. "Captain," Daniel said over the comm, "we need to go down there. We need to understand what did this." "I know," Reeves replied. "James, collect your samples. Let's give the Endeavour crew what comfort we can, and then prepare for surface deployment. And God help us all." The landing party suited up in the Aurora's prep bay. The isolation suits were military grade, designed for hostile biological environments, with self-contained atmosphere and multiple layers of filtration. Daniel checked his suit's seals 3 times, watching the status indicators carefully. Beside him, Alina did the same, her movements precise and mechanical. Liam was running diagnostics on their communication systems, his young face set with determination. "Remember the protocols," Reeves said over the intercom from the bridge. 6 hours maximum on the surface, continuous biological monitoring. Any signs of breach, any signs of cognitive impairment, you return to the shuttle immediately. I'll be monitoring your vitals from orbit. James will be on standby in case we need emergency medical intervention. Understood?" "Understood," they replied in unison. The shuttle descent was smooth. Liam piloted with steady hands despite his inexperience, following the coordinates Wells had logged for their landing site. The planet grew larger in the viewport, blue and green and beautiful, a jewel in the darkness of space. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were descending into the mouth of something vast and patient, something that had been waiting for them. They touched down in a clearing 3 kilometers from one of the cities. The landing was gentle, barely a bump. Through the viewport, Daniel could see the landscape, and it was stunning. Purple-tinged grass waved in a gentle breeze. Trees with spiral bark patterns reached toward a sky painted in shades of turquoise and violet. In the distance, the spires of the city rose like fingers reaching for the heavens, though even from here, Daniel could see they were shorter than they appeared in the satellite imagery from orbit. "Atmospheric readings are stable," Liam reported. "Oxygen, nitrogen, trace gases, all within human-tolerable ranges. Temperature is 21 degrees. There's no radiation, no obvious toxins in the air. By all standard measures, this place is paradise." "Paradise," Alina murmured. "Paradise for whom?" They exited the shuttle, boots crunching on the alien soil. The gravity was slightly less than Earth's, making each step feel light, almost bouncy. Daniel looked around, taking in the alien landscape. It really was beautiful. The colours were slightly off. The plant life followed different structural patterns, but the overall effect was of a place that could support life, complex life. This should have been a place where civilization thrived. Instead, it was a graveyard of regression. They began walking toward the city, instruments scanning continuously. Daniel noticed something odd, almost immediately. His boot print in the soft earth behind him was filling in. Not from wind, not from insects or small animals disturbing the soil, but from the soil itself. It was regenerating, returning to its undisturbed state, as if his foot had never touched it. "Are you seeing this?" Liam asked, his voice tight with wonder and fear. "Confirmed," Alina said, kneeling to examine the phenomenon more closely. Her gloved hand pressed into the soil, leaving a clear imprint. She held it there for a count of 10, then lifted it. The imprint began to fill in immediately, the displaced earth flowing back like liquid, smoothing out until no trace remained. The soil itself is reversing localized entropy. It's actively returning to a previous state. "That's not possible," Liam said, but the evidence was right there in front of them. "It shouldn't be possible," Daniel corrected, "but we're not in a place where the usual rules apply. Keep moving. We've got 5 hours and 45 minutes left." The walk to the city took 30 minutes. As they got closer, the architecture became clearer, and it was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. The buildings seemed to grow from the ground rather than being constructed on top of it, organic curves flowing seamlessly into geometric precision, but they were melting. There was no other word for it. A tower that must have once soared 50 stories high was now barely 30, its top section having somehow compressed or dissolved, or simply ceased to be. As they watched, a decorative element on one building's facade smoothed out, detail fading into a blank wall. "It's happening in real time," Alina breathed. "The regression. We're watching it happen." They entered through what might have once been a grand archway. Intricate carvings covered its surface, but even as Daniel documented them with his suit's camera, they were simplifying. Faces became smooth ovals. Geometric patterns became simple lines. Within minutes, the archway would be just stone, and soon after that, it would probably sink back into the earth from which it came. The interior of the city was a maze of structures in various states of degradation. Some buildings still retained most of their complexity, sophisticated designs that spoke of an advanced civilization. Others had regressed to simple stone blocks, barely distinguishable from natural rock formations. And everywhere, the process continued. Daniel watched a piece of furniture in one building transform before his eyes. It had been something like a chair, ergonomically designed with what looked like integrated technology. Over the course of 10 minutes, the technology faded. The ergonomic curves straightened and simplified, and it became a simple stool. Then, just a piece of wood. "I need to collect samples," Alina said, pulling out a collection kit. "Soil, plant matter, pieces of these buildings. Whatever's causing this, we need to understand it at a molecular level." While Alina worked, Daniel and Liam explored deeper into the city. They found what must have been a central plaza, a vast open space surrounded by tall structures. In the center was a fountain, or what had been a fountain. Water still flowed, but the elaborate sculpture that had once crowned it was now just a rough column of stone. And in the water, Daniel saw movement. "Liam, look at this." They approached the fountain carefully. In the shallow water, fish-like creatures swam in lazy circles. But as Daniel watched, one of them began to change. Its fins, complex and multi-lobed, simplified, becoming single extensions. Its scales smoothed out. Its eyes, which had been large and complex, shrank and simplified. Within 15 minutes, the creature looked like something from the Devonian period, a primitive fish that would have looked at home in Earth's ancient seas. "It's accelerating," Liam said, his voice shaking. "Whatever's causing the regression, it's getting faster." "Or more concentrated here," Daniel suggested. "This plaza, the city centre, this might be where it started, where the civilization that built this place released whatever mechanism is driving the change." They continued their exploration, moving through buildings that were becoming caves, across streets that were becoming dirt paths, and then Liam shouted, "There! I found something!" He was standing in front of a large structure at the far end of the plaza. Unlike the other buildings, this one still retained most of its complexity. It was a pyramid, massive and imposing, with sides that rose at a precise angle. The surface was covered in markings, some kind of writing or symbolic representation, though much of it had already faded. "This has to be important," Liam said. "Something this big, this central. It had to have significance to whoever built this city." "It's also the most intact structure we've seen," Alina added, joining them. "Whatever's causing the regression, it's progressing from the outside in. This pyramid might be the source point, or at least a key to understanding what happened." "Then let's get inside," Daniel said. "We've got 4 hours left. Let's make them count." The entrance to the pyramid was a tall doorway, still ornately carved, though the details were fading. They stepped through into darkness, their suit lights illuminating smooth walls that curved upward into shadow. The interior was warmer than outside, and Daniel's suit sensors detected higher concentrations of the microorganisms Tanaka had mentioned in her logs. They were everywhere here, dense clouds of microscopic life hanging in the air, like invisible fog. "Filters are working," Liam reported, checking his suit's status. "Nothing's getting through. We're safe." "For now," Alina said quietly. They moved deeper into the pyramid, following a corridor that sloped gently downward. The walls were covered in murals, vast paintings or carvings that told a story. Daniel stopped to examine them, his suit's camera documenting everything, even as the details continued to fade. The story began simply enough. Primitive beings, roughly humanoid, but with differences, 4 arms instead of 2, skin marked with bioluminescent patterns. They hunted with simple tools, gathered food, lived in small tribes. The murals progressed, showing the development of agriculture, the founding of cities, the invention of writing and mathematics. It was the story of civilization rising from savagery, a tale as old as human history, but played out by a different species on a different world. But then the narrative shifted. The beings discovered something, depicted as a swirling vortex of symbols and patterns. They studied it, experimented with it. The murals showed them growing younger, saw injuries healing, diseases disappearing. They'd found a way to reverse biological damage, to reset their bodies to earlier states. It must have seemed like a miracle, an end to aging, to death, to all the accumulated damage of living. The next section of murals showed the celebration. The beings lived for centuries, never aging, never dying. They built greater cities, explored their world, reached for the stars. But then, something went wrong. The murals became darker, more chaotic. The reversal process had escaped their control. It wasn't just healing injuries anymore. It was reversing their entire evolutionary history. Adults became children. Children became infants. Infants became something less, something that came before. And it didn't stop with people. The murals showed their cities simplifying, their technology failing, their knowledge being forgotten. The beings tried to stop it, tried to contain it, but the process was irreversible. The later murals showed them making a choice, though the details were hard to make out through the fading. They could fight the regression, watch their bodies revert, while their minds remained trapped in awareness, or they could surrender to it, let go of consciousness and return to the beginning peacefully. The final intact mural showed them gathered in this very pyramid, in a chamber somewhere below. They'd chosen surrender, chosen to return to the simple life they'd started from, to let evolution begin again, to give their world a chance to try once more. And then they'd release the mechanism planet-wide, ensuring that everything, every living thing, would be caught in the regression, a reset button for an entire biosphere. The last symbol on the wall was elegant in its simplicity, a spiral curving inward, ending at a single point, the beginning. They did this on purpose, Alina whispered. This wasn't an accident or a plague. They chose this. But why? Liam asked. They'd achieved immortality. Why throw that away? Because immortality came with a price, Daniel said, studying the murals. Look at these earlier sections. Before they discovered the reversal technique, their art shows individuals, families, communities. After, it's just crowds, masses of identical beings who never changed. They'd stopped evolving, stopped growing. Maybe they realized that a species that never dies, never faces mortality, never makes room for new generations, that's a species that stagnates, dies in a different way. So they chose regression over stagnation, Alina said, chose to go backwards so that eventually something could move forward again. But they didn't just affect themselves, they released it into the entire biosphere. Insurance, Daniel suggested. If they'd just reversed themselves, another species might evolve and make the same mistakes. This way, everything goes back to the beginning. Single-celled organisms, maybe just amino acids in warm water. Evolution gets a complete do-over. That's insane, Liam said, destroying billions of years of evolutionary progress just for a chance to start over. Is it? Alina asked. From their perspective, they'd reached a dead end, achieved immortality, and found it was a trap. The only way out was to break the cycle completely, return to the beginning, and hope the next iteration makes better choices. They stood in silence, contemplating the magnitude of what they were seeing. An entire civilization choosing extinction, choosing regression, not out of despair but out of hope. Hope that the wheel would turn again, that evolution would climb the ladder once more, and that next time whoever reached the top would find a better answer than the one they'd found. We should document the rest of the pyramid, Daniel said finally. If there's a central chamber where they initiated this, we need to find it, need to understand the mechanism completely. They descended deeper, following the corridor as it spiraled down into the heart of the pyramid. The air grew warmer, the concentration of microorganisms thicker. Daniel watched his suit's filtration system working overtime, capturing and neutralizing the microscopic entities that filled the air like snow. The corridor opened into a vast chamber. It was circular, easily 100 meters in diameter, with a ceiling that soared up into darkness. In the center of the chamber was a pool of liquid, glowing with a soft bioluminescence. The walls were covered in more murals, these ones showing the molecular structure of the regression mechanism. Daniel wasn't a microbiologist, but even he could recognize the elegance of the design. The organisms didn't attack DNA directly. Instead, they interfered with gene expression, activating dormant ancestral genes while suppressing more recent evolutionary developments. They triggered the body's own systems to reverse themselves, convince cells that they were younger, simpler, earlier versions of themselves. "This is it," Alina said, moving to the pool's edge. "This is where it started. The source point, the concentration of organisms here, is thousands of times higher than anywhere else on the planet." "Alina, be careful," James's voice crackled over their comms from orbit. "Your suit's filtration is being overwhelmed. Back away from the pool." But Alina didn't move. She was staring at the liquid, at the way it pulsed and shifted, almost as if it were alive. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Terrifying, but beautiful. They didn't just create a biological weapon. They created an answer, a solution to the problem of consciousness itself." "Alina, what are you talking about?" Daniel moved to her side, concerned by the dreamy quality in her voice. "Don't you see? Consciousness is the trap. Awareness, intelligence, the ability to think and remember and fear and hope. That's what makes death terrible. That's what makes stagnation unbearable. But if you remove consciousness, if you return to the simple existence of organisms that just are, that experience the eternal now, without past or future, then there's no suffering, no fear, no existential dread, just being." "Alina, your biometrics are changing," James said urgently. "Neural activity is fluctuating. Your suit must have a micro-breach. Get out of there. Now." Daniel grabbed Alina's arm, pulling her back from the pool. "Liam, help me. We need to get her back to the shuttle." But before they could move, Alina reached up and touched the seal of her helmet. Her gloved fingers found the manual release, the emergency system designed to allow quick removal in case of suit failure. "Alina, don't!" Daniel lunged for her, but he was too slow. The helmet seal broke with a hiss. The atmosphere of the chamber, thick with microscopic organisms, flooded in. Alina took a deep breath, her eyes closing, a smile crossing her face. "Now I'll know," she whispered. "Now I'll understand what Sergei understood." Daniel and Liam dragged her back, resealing her helmet, but the damage was done. She'd been exposed for maybe 5 seconds, but that was enough. Through her helmet, Daniel could see her face already changing. The lines around her eyes were smoothing out, the grey in her hair fading to dark brown. But worse was the look in her eyes, a dreamy confusion spreading across her features like a shadow. "Get her to the shuttle," Daniel ordered. "Liam, go. I'll follow with the samples." Liam didn't argue. He got Alina's arm over his shoulder and half carried, half dragged her toward the corridor. Daniel could hear her mumbling, her words already slurring, complex thoughts breaking down into simpler phrases. "Pretty lights. Warm. Feel good. Why was I worried? So much worry. Easier without..." Daniel worked quickly, collecting samples from the pool, from the walls, from the air itself. His suit's systems were screaming warnings. Filtration at maximum, minor breaches detected in the material where it had brushed against the rough stone walls. He had minutes, maybe less, before he'd be exposed. But he needed this data. Needed to understand the mechanism well enough to warn Earth, to convince them that this entire system needed to be quarantined forever. He sealed the last sample container and turned to leave. That's when he noticed his hands. Through the gloves, he could see his skin. The age spots were fading. The wrinkles around his knuckles were smoothing out, and when he tried to remember the complex molecular structures he'd been studying, tried to recall the technical terms, they slipped away like water through his fingers. "James," he said into his comm, forcing his mind to focus. "I've been exposed. Minor breach. I'm heading back to the shuttle, but I don't know how long I have before cognitive effects become severe." "How long were you exposed?" "Maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. It's hard to tell. Time feels strange." "Get to the shuttle, now. We'll prepare the medical bay for decontamination procedures." Daniel ran. Through the corridor, up the slope, out into the dying city. But as he ran, he felt his thoughts simplifying. The mission objectives became fuzzy. Why was he running? Running from what? The city was beautiful. The double suns were warm. He was tired, so tired. Maybe he should rest. No, keep moving. The shuttle. Have to reach the shuttle. But why? What's a shuttle? He stumbled, fell, pushed himself back up. His body felt strange, younger, stronger, but his mind was fogging. He could see the shuttle ahead, could see Liam waving at him from the airlock. Who was that? Someone important? A friend? The concept of friendship was becoming abstract, hard to grasp. Strong hands grabbed him, pulled him into the shuttle. The airlock sealed. The engines roared. And then they were rising, climbing away from the beautiful planet with its warm suns and simple life. Why were they leaving? It had been nice there, peaceful. Daniel's last clear thought before his consciousness fully fragmented was a hope. Hope that he'd gathered enough data. Hope that his sacrifice, and Alina's, and the crew of the Endeavour, and the entire civilization that had once thrived on Threshold 7, hope that all of it meant something, that the warning would be heard, that humanity would learn from this and never make the same mistakes. Then the thought slipped away, and he was floating in a warm confusion where words didn't quite work anymore, and the world was simple, and everything was okay. On the Aurora, James worked frantically in the medical bay. Liam had brought both Daniel and Alina aboard, and gotten them into isolation chambers before his own suit could be compromised. The chambers were equipped with air filtration systems, powerful enough to strip every microorganism from the atmosphere, but it was too late for that. Daniel and Alina had been exposed. The regression had begun. James ran scan after scan, documenting the process with scientific detachment, even as his heart broke. Daniel's cellular age was decreasing by approximately 1 year every 2 hours. His neural complexity was dropping even faster. Language centers were shutting down, long-term memory consolidation reversing, higher reasoning functions simplifying into basic instinct and immediate sensation. Alina was worse, or further along, depending on how you looked at it. She'd had greater exposure, had actually breathed the contaminated air deeply. She was already at the level of a young child, playing with simple objects James had given her, responding to her name but unable to form complex sentences. In another few hours, she'd lose language entirely. In a day, maybe 2, she'd be pre-verbal, and the process would continue until... Until what? How far back did it go? Would it stop at early hominid, at ape, at mammal? Or would it continue all the way back to the first cells, reducing human beings to soup in a container? "Captain," James said over the intercom, "we have a problem. The microorganisms they brought back are viable. They're dormant in vacuum and cold, but in a human-compatible atmosphere, they wake up. If we bring them back to Earth, if even one sample breaks containment, then Earth becomes Threshold 7, Reeves finished. The entire planet caught in regression. 7 billion people reverting to primordial ooze. Jesus. The samples need to be destroyed. All of them. And Daniel and Alina... James couldn't finish the sentence. Can they be saved? Not by me. Not with anything we have. Maybe if we had decades and unlimited resources, maybe we could develop a therapy. But even then, the people they were are gone. their memories, their personalities, the neural pathways that made them unique individuals. Those are being erased. We'd be creating new people, not saving the old ones. Reeves was silent for a long moment. What do they need? What would make them comfortable? Honestly, the surface, they're not suited for this environment anymore. This ship, the technology, the complexity, it's meaningless to them now. They need open space, simple food, social contact with their own kind. They need what the Endeavour crew has, a chance to live out their lives in peace, however long those lives might be. Then that's what we'll give them. We'll transport them down to the surface along with the Endeavour crew. Let them live as a group, as a tribe. They'll have each other at least. And we'll leave them supplies, simple tools, things they can use at whatever level they settle at. And the samples? We jettison them into the sun, every single one. No data survives except what's in our computer systems, and that gets classified at the highest level. This mission, this planet, it all gets sealed. No one ever comes back here. James nodded, though Reeves couldn't see him. It was the right decision, the only decision. But it still felt like failure. Over the next 3 days, they prepared for the transfer. James watched as Daniel regressed through the stages of human development, his mind simplifying hour by hour. There were moments of clarity, brief windows where Daniel seemed to remember who he was, what he'd been trying to do. In one of those moments, he'd managed to activate the recorder in his isolation chamber and leave a message. James played it for the crew. Daniel's face on the screen was younger, maybe 30 years old, but his eyes held a mix of confusion and desperate urgency. I'm Dr. Daniel Cross. Daniel Cross. If you're watching this, I'm gone. But you need to remember. The planet. Threshold 7. It's not just dangerous, it's a trap. The microorganisms, they're not confined to the atmosphere. They can survive in dormancy. If they spread, if they reach Earth. He paused, struggling to hold on to the thought. You have to warn them. Have to make them understand. Some doors shouldn't be opened. Some knowledge is too dangerous. The civilization there, they reached too far, found the secret of immortality, and it destroyed them. We can't make the same mistake. He looked directly at the camera, and for just a moment, his expression was perfectly clear, perfectly lucid. Don't come looking for me. Don't send rescue missions. I chose this. I'm choosing to stay and document what I can for as long as I can. But please, please promise me you'll seal this system. Make it forbidden. Forever. His expression clouded again, confusion returning. I'm forgetting. Words are hard. Thinking is hard. But the data, the samples we collected, they're in the storage, container 7. Make sure they get to... He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. The video ended. Container 7 was jettisoned into the star this morning, Reeves said quietly. Along with all the other samples, nothing survives. Except us, Liam said. We survive. We remember. We're the only record of what happened here. Then we'd better make it count, James replied. The transfer of Daniel, Alina, and the Endeavour crew to the surface was completed on day 4. Reeves piloted the shuttle herself, bringing them down to a temperate region near the city, but away from the pyramid's source point. The regression would be slower here, would give them time to adapt to each new stage. The 6 crew members from the Endeavour were docile, accepting the transfer without complaint or understanding. They'd been living as primitive hominids for months now, had adapted to their reduced state. Daniel and Alina were different. They were still in transition, caught between human and whatever came before. Daniel kept trying to speak, kept trying to express thoughts his mind could no longer form. He'd point at things, make sounds that might have been words once, look at Reeves with eyes that still held a spark of recognition. But it was fading fast. By the time they landed, he could barely walk upright. His posture was changing, his spine curving, his gait becoming more suited to moving on all fours. Alina had let go earlier. She no longer tried to speak, no longer showed signs of recognizing her former crewmates. She moved with the unconscious grace of something that existed purely in the moment, responding to immediate stimuli, untroubled by memory or anticipation. In a strange way, she seemed peaceful. Reeves left them with supplies. Simple tools, dried food, containers for water, things they could use now or later depending on how far the regression took them. She set up an automated camera to record them, to document what happened next. Not out of scientific curiosity, but out of respect. They deserved to have their fate recorded, to have their sacrifice remembered. As the shuttle lifted off, Reeves watched them through the viewport. The 8 figures, the survivors of 2 missions, gathered together. Daniel looked up at the ascending shuttle, his eyes tracking its movement. For just a moment, Reeves thought she saw understanding in that gaze, a final flicker of the man he'd been. Then he turned away, back to the others, back to the simple life that awaited them. The Aurora broke orbit 12 hours later. The jettison of the samples had been completed, the data secured in encrypted files, the coordinates of Threshold 7 marked as forbidden. Reeves set course for Earth, for home, for the long journey back to report what they'd found and what it had cost. Liam spent most of the journey compiling a comprehensive report, every detail documented, every video log preserved. The transformation of the Endeavour crew, Daniel's sacrifice, Alina's exposure, the civilization that chose to end itself rather than continue in stagnant immortality. All of it was recorded, analysed, preserved. James reviewed the medical data obsessively, looking for something he'd missed, some way the regression could have been stopped or slowed. He never found it. The mechanism was too elegant, too perfectly designed. The beings who'd created it had intended it to be irreversible, a one-way door back to the beginning. Reeves focused on the practical aspects of their return: resources, trajectory, ship maintenance. But in her quiet moments, she thought about Daniel Cross, about the choice he'd made. He could have stayed on the Aurora, could have been sedated and kept comfortable as the regression took him. Instead, he'd chosen to gather data, to expose himself deliberately, to sacrifice his humanity for the chance to warn others. That took courage of a kind Reeves wasn't sure she possessed. 1 year later, the Aurora docked at Earth Station 1. The quarantine procedures were extensive and thorough. Every surface of the ship was sterilized. Every crew member tested repeatedly for the regression microorganisms. None were found. The organisms couldn't survive without the specific conditions of Threshold 7, without the perfect temperature and atmospheric composition and biological density. They died within days of leaving the planet's atmosphere. The crew was debriefed by a committee that included representatives from every major space agency. Liam's report was reviewed. Daniel's video logs were played. The medical data was analysed. The reaction was shock, horror, and finally determination. The coordinates of Threshold 7 were classified at the highest level. A 50 light-year exclusion zone was established around the system. Any ship that violated the quarantine would be destroyed without warning, but the data itself, the knowledge of what had happened there, that was preserved, sealed, restricted, but preserved. Because as Reeves argued before the committee, the lesson was too important to bury completely. Humanity needed to know that immortality came with a price, that some frontiers weren't meant to be crossed, that progress could reverse, that evolution could run backward, and that the universe held dangers more subtle and terrifying than anyone had imagined. 3 months after their return, Reeves, James and Liam attended a memorial service. Commander Patricia Wells, Dr. Richard Brennan, Dr. Carmen Ortiz, Lieutenant Thomas Griffin, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Specialist David Morse, Dr. Daniel Cross, and Dr. Alina Petrov. 8 names added to the monument that honoured those lost in deep space exploration. 8 people who had ventured beyond human knowledge and paid the ultimate price. But they'd succeeded in their mission. Threshold 7 was sealed. Earth was warned. The data they'd gathered, bought with their humanity, would ensure that no one ever made the same mistakes as the civilization that had once thrived on that distant world. Liam stood before the monument, reading the names carved in stone. His hands were steady, his voice clear. He'd come through the mission changed, aged beyond his years by what he'd seen. They gave everything, he said quietly, not just their lives, but their minds, their memories, everything that made them who they were, so that we could know, so that we could learn, so that we could survive. Do you think they knew? James asked. At the end, when they'd regressed too far to think clearly, do you think they still understood what they'd sacrificed? I don't know, Reeves said, but I hope not. I hope by that point they were peaceful, living in the moment, untroubled by the past or future. That seems like a mercy. They stood in silence, paying their respects. Then Reeves spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of command, even in this informal setting. Daniel asked us to seal the system, to make it forbidden forever. We've done that, but he also asked us to remember, to learn, to make sure humanity never makes the same mistakes. That's on us now. That's our burden to carry. I've been thinking about that civilization, Liam said. About the choice they made. They achieved immortality, conquered aging and disease, reached the stars, and they threw it all away because they realized they'd trapped themselves. Do you think they were right? I don't know if right is the word, James replied, but I understand it. Immortality without growth, without change, without the cycle of generations. That's not living. That's existing. They chose to give their world a second chance, even if it meant erasing everything they'd built. That takes a kind of wisdom we haven't achieved yet. Maybe we will, Reeves said. Someday. When we've explored more, learned more, faced our own mortality as a species. Maybe then we'll understand why they made that choice. Or maybe we'll find a different answer, a better answer. But we won't find it by repeating their path. That's the lesson Daniel died to teach us. They left the monument as the sun set over Earth Station 1. In the observation deck, Reeves paused to look out at the planet below, blue and green and alive with 7 billion people going about their lives, unaware of how close they'd come to losing everything. Unaware that somewhere out there, 1,200 light years away, a world was slowly reverting to primordial soup. A world where 8 human beings were living out their lives as something less than human, something simpler, something that came before. Reeves pulled up the last transmission from the automated camera they'd left on Threshold 7. It had functioned for 6 months before finally failing, and the footage it captured had been included in the classified files. The final frame showed the group no longer recognizable as the people they'd been. They moved on all fours, communicated in grunts and gestures, lived as their ancestors had lived millions of years ago. But they were alive, together, a tribe. One of the figures looked at the camera in that final frame. Reeves had studied the image for hours, trying to determine which one it was. The body structure suggested male, the posture implied youth. It could have been Daniel. It could have been Richard Brennan, or Thomas Griffin, or David Morse. There was no way to know. But whoever it was, for just a moment, there seemed to be something in the eyes. A flicker, A spark. As if somewhere deep inside, some tiny fragment of memory remained. Some echo of consciousness trying to break through. Then the camera failed and the image was lost. Reeves closed the file and walked away. Behind her, Earth turned slowly in the darkness, unaware and safe. The forbidden zone held. The warning had been given. And somewhere in the vast universe, evolution continued its eternal climb, balanced always on the edge of the abyss, one mistake away from the long fall backward into the darkness from which all life emerged. That was the lesson. That was the warning. That was Daniel Cross's final gift to humanity. Remember it well.